All right, so check this out. How many of you have like a nativity scene at home? Anybody have a nativity scene? Maybe you set it up under the tree or near the tree or somewhere else in the house. So you probably have like a stable, a little manger. You know, you've got a Mary and a Joseph and a baby Jesus. How many of you have wise men? Any of your sets have wise men? And you set them up there with the stable and so forth. Now, you guys, you probably realize this. You know, the Bible tells us that these wise men came from the east. And what it doesn't tell us is exactly when they arrived. Now, this morning, Bill Welsh, in character as Josiah, the shepherd of Bethlehem, reminded us that Mary and Joseph and Jesus stayed in Bethlehem for the best part of 2 years. And it was probably closer to the 2-year mark before these wise men arrived from the east. So it's a little bit of an historical inaccuracy when we put them right there by the stable, peering into the manger. If you wanted to be more historically accurate, when you set your nativity scene up, you know, under the tree, you should probably put the wise men in the backyard, because it's going to take them a while before they get there. But part of the question is, how did they even know? How did these wise men who came from so far away that it took them a couple of years to get there, how did they even know to look for the star, to interpret it the way they did, to follow it to Bethlehem? Well, before we're done tonight, we're going to try to answer that question. Now, it's been several months since we were here last. We were here on a Sunday night in the spring. I want to say it was an M-letter month. March, May, I don't know, it was somewhere in there. Were any of you guys here then? So has anyone moved since then? What's that been, 7, 8 months? Yeah, I saw at least one hand. Anybody got a move coming up? Like, you know, in the not too distant future, you're going to be moving. I was talking to my dad today. He just moved from Orange County to the Phoenix area, and he was telling me how many boxes he's unpacked this week. So you know how moves go, right? You've got boxes and box cutters and bubble wrap and, utility dollies and tie downs and all that kind of stuff. You start thinking about all of that. It's so overwhelming. You know, they have websites now dedicated to the perfect move. Like, if you have enough time, you can plan your move out months in advance. They'll give you checklists of things to do 6 months out. Again, if you know that soon. For sure, though, things like 1 month out, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, day before, day of. Anybody getting PTSD just thinking about all of that stress, all of that pressure? Like 40 million Americans move every year. And there are so many different reasons why we move. Sometimes we want to move. Other times we totally don't want to move. Sometimes a move comes as part of the aftermath of a major disruption in our lives. It could follow a death. It could follow a divorce. It could follow a job loss or an unanticipated transfer. But regardless of whether you want to move or don't want to move, there's just so much stress associated with all of those things. We're gonna take a little bit deeper dive into this. Let's go ahead and turn in our Bibles to Daniel chapter 1. So, see, here's the thing. The Bible is actually filled with stories about people who relocated. People who moved. When you think about it, the whole Bible is about people who relocated. I mean, let's think about the bookends of the Bible. In the book of Genesis, you have Adam and Eve who were evicted from their home in the garden. In the book of Revelation, you have all of us getting a new home, right? And in between, of course, we find the Christmas story, which also involves a relocation. You know, they took a road trip to Bethlehem that turned into quite a long relocation to Egypt, all part of the Christmas story, and part of what we'll answer when we talk later about how the wise men knew. But all of these people, including the man that we're going to study this morning, learned that there can be transformation in relocation. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I wasn't one of the people that raised my hand. Like, I haven't moved recently. I'm not moving anytime soon. How does this apply to me? It totally applies to you because I'm using relocation as a metaphor for change. We all experience change. We're all changing all of the time. We're all going through transitions. And 2019 is a year that will likely involve transition for me and for my family and perhaps for you and for your family. So we need to know how to make the most out of change, how to experience transformation and relocation. Daniel is such a great example, relocated against his will from Judah to Babylon. So just to get the ball rolling, we're going to talk first about Daniel at the food court, beginning in verse 1. Daniel 1, verse 1. It says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, just to put this on a timeline, this is like 6 centuries before Christ. So if we're like 2,000 years this side of the cross, they were like 600 years that side of the cross. And we know from reading the Bible, but also from comparing extra-biblical literature, we know that Nebuchadnezzar came and sieged Jerusalem not once, not twice, but 3 times. And he took captives all 3 times. This was the first of those 3 times. And among those taken, well, he took Jehoiakim. Now, Jehoiakim, the king, wouldn't be gone long. Soon after, Nebuchadnezzar would take him and drop him right back in the land as a puppet king. But he was not alone when he was taken. There were others. We want to talk about those. You guys remember when you were in school, and at the end of the year you would get an annual? I don't know that we called them that. We always called them yearbooks where I went to school, but an annual, a yearbook. You know, inside would be like everybody's school picture. There might be a class photo, like of your whole class and the other classes. Also, there were pictures, like photographers, right, would go to all the events throughout the year, homecoming, stuff like that, take pictures. So it's always fun to look and see if your picture was in there besides just your school picture. And they always had those things that people would vote on, right, like most likely to succeed, stuff like that. I have a pastor friend who, when he was a teenager, was voted most likely to go to hell, which is ironic since he helps people not go there for a living now. If his feelings were hurt, it didn't last long because he soon discovered that in the same polling, his brother had been voted most likely to marry outside the species. So somehow he found what he got comforting as compared to what his brother got. Nebuchadnezzar was looking for these guys that were voted most likely to succeed. I mean, the way they're described for us in verses 3 and 4, these guys were to be physically and mentally fit. Now, as an aside, if we could just press the pause button. As an aside, notice that phrase. We read, master of eunuchs. If you're like me, you know people who don't take the Bible seriously, right? You probably do. Why else would you listen to me talk about it for 40 minutes or so? But we all have friends, maybe even family members, neighbors, coworkers that don't. And sometimes they'll say things like this. Sometimes they'll say things like, well, the reason I don't take the Bible seriously is because it's filled with contradictions. Have you ever heard that? The next time someone says that to you, I suggest that you hand them a Bible and ask them to show you one. I promise you, 99 times in 100, they have no idea where to turn. And, they're just repeating something that their parents taught them, something that their college professor said, something that they heard on some TV show or something. But the one time in 100 that they can take you to a difficult passage, and there are some difficult passages. So the one time in 100 they can take you to one, I promise you that if you'll just go, do a little bit of homework, you'll be able to come back with a really thoughtful, well-reasoned response. But so they'll say things like that. It's full of contradictions. Or they'll say, well, it's filled with pre-scientific, inaccuracies. Or they'll say that, there are things in it that just don't add up or just don't make sense, like historically. This is one of the things they pointed to for the longest time. For the longest time, critics of the Bible said that there was no evidence that there had ever been any such position or role in Babylon as the master of eunuchs. That is, until archaeologists found this thing called the Babylonian Chronicle. There on this clay tablet was a reference to the Rabsaris, which means, you guessed it, master eunuch. And so if you ever have the opportunity to visit the British Museum, you can actually see this clay tablet with your own eyes. Just one of so many reasons why we take the Bible seriously. But back to where we were. Release that pause button. So Nebuchadnezzar had in mind for these guys a 3-year conditioning program. What he wanted to do was to reprogram their minds. He wanted to change their thoughts and their beliefs, starting with their education. See in verse 4, the reference to language and literature. I've always admired people who can speak more than one language. My wife, Miranda, is bilingual. She was born to American missionaries in Italy. So she spoke Italian before she ever spoke English. She lived in Italy till she was 8 years old. And then as an adult and as a Christian recording artist, she actually recorded one of her albums in Italian and did a tour of Italy. How cool is that? I think that's really cool. 2 languages. So I'm still working on mastering English, but she's got those 2 down really, really well. I think that's a cool thing. I remember when my eldest daughter, Lauren, was in high school, there was that time early in a semester when, as a parent, you would go and sort of follow their schedule. Like the bell would ring and you'd go to the next class. And, instead of an hour-long class or whatever, it'd be, 10 minutes. So you'd cycle through all of their teachers in one evening. So there I am in her Spanish classroom. Her Spanish teacher had a bizarre obsession with Chewbacca. I don't know why, but all things Chewbacca. And it was all year long. He talked about Chewbacca. It has nothing to do with my point. I just totally thought you should know that. But so he did his little presentation, right? He talked about, his syllabus, his expectations, blah, 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 all that stuff. And then like every other teacher that I visited that night, he took questions. Only in this classroom, no one had a question. So awkward. Those times when you're in a room with a bunch of people and you can hear a pin drop and you're just like so embarrassed for the person that's leading the meeting. Anybody should have asked him something, anything. I should have hooked him up. I should have thrown him a bone. And the truth is, I had a question for him. I totally should have asked him why, after 2 years of high school Spanish, all I can remember is "Tu estás loco." Now, that could come in handy now and again, but I got a B. You'd think I'd remember more than that, right? So these Babylonians, they were super educated. Like we know now that they were really advanced in subjects like astronomy and mathematics, but this isn't just about education. Like we're not against education, right? I'm certainly not. When I look back on my life, I wish that I had gotten more education and not less. Like now I'm interested in so many things. And if I could rewind, the things that I would love to study and know more about. But Nebuchadnezzar, as good as education is, he wasn't just trying to educate them. He was trying to move them away from the Bible. The Bible is the book that told them as Jews who they were. It's the book that told them who God was. It's the book that explained to them what it meant for them to be as a group of people in a covenant relationship with God. It's even the book that would have made sense out of why they were in captivity and even given them an idea how long it might last. That was the last thing Nebuchadnezzar wanted them learning more about, or thinking about, or reflecting, or meditating on. So he's moving them away from the Bible. Their education. Second thing he wants to tackle is their culture. Notice again in verse 5 the reference to delicacies and wine. Seriously, Babylon must have seemed like a food court to these teenage boys. Have you ever tried to keep teenagers fed? Do you relate to the whole idea of coming home from like Sam's Club or Costco and filling the refrigerator and filling the pantry and going to sit down on the couch? Before you sit down on the couch, the refrigerator and the pantry are empty. Like, how does that happen? So here's these guys. They're already teenage boys eating the way teenage boys do. And keep in mind, they're coming from a city that's been under siege. The first thing you do if you besieged a city in ancient times is cut off the food supply. So these guys were starving, and here they were surrounded by food, and yet as we're going to learn, they were conflicted about the food. We're going to talk more about this, about why they were conflicted and stuff, but they were conflicted. Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Now, the Babylonians, we know they were super cultured. Not just when it comes to food, but archaeologists have found extraordinary objects of art and stuff. So we know that they were sophisticated in this way, and culture is not a bad thing, right? Like, it's good to be exposed to culture, to expose our kids to things that might be considered culture, but he was trying to move them away from their lifestyle. See, in the Bible, they had dietary laws. God had given them these dietary laws that had lists of things to eat and things not to eat, and even ideas as to how they should and should not prepare the foods that they ate. And so, again, Nebuchadnezzar isn't just trying to expose them to new food and new cultural experiences. He's trying to move them away from their God-given lifestyle. I mean, think of it. If you were Daniel and his friends, then throughout your lifetime, every time you sat down to eat, I mean every time, every breakfast, every lunch, every dinner, every time you were gathered around a table with the people that you love, you would be reminded, based on what was on your plate, based on what was not on your plate, based on how the things on your plate had been prepared, you would be reminded about your special relationship with God. Nebuchadnezzar did not want them thinking about that. So again, he's trying to move them away from their lifestyle. Their education, their culture. There's a third thing he wanted to go after, and that was directly at their religion. I mean, notice in verse 6 the reference to new names. Have you ever wished that you had a different name? Ever thought about changing your name? Ever wondered why someone else didn't change their name? Have you ever been watching TV when they talk about what, the latest celebrity birth was named? And you hear these names and you think, what in the world? Or sometimes you meet somebody and you hear their name and you're like, oh my goodness. I mean, sometimes it's not even that first name or that last name, but it's the combination of that first name and that last name. And you're like how intoxicated were your parents in the hospital to have put those two names together? Like, how does this even happen? I have to admit, I'm one of those people who has thought at different times in my life about changing my name. My last name is Rigg. And you know how kids are, man. It didn't take very long in school for my classmates to figure out that Rigg rhymes with pig. So I didn't stay Rigg for long. Pretty soon I was Rigg Pig. And then just Pig for short. And because people cannot help themselves, like there is this gravitational pull to put an S on the end of my name. It could not possibly be Rigg. It must be Riggs. So Pig quickly became Pigs. So I'd be walking down the hall at school. Somebody would turn away from their locker and see me and be like, hey, what's up, Pigs? Pigs, like I hated that. So I had to think about what am I going to do about my name? Now, one idea that I had was that if I ever had a son, I was going to name him Big. Because Big Rigg would be the coolest boy's name ever. Tell me I'm wrong. Come on now. Got 2 beautiful daughters and a beautiful granddaughter. I never got to pull the trigger on that one, but I wanted to use that. And then back in the 80s, I played in this Christian glam rock band in Hollywood. And, I thought maybe I'd make a career out of that. Maybe I'd be so fortunate as to even have a solo career after that. And I had it all figured out. My first solo album would be called Riggamarole, because it sounds like rock and roll, right? And then my second album, I'd call it Rigatoni, just because I could. And then, when I got tired, a lot of years recording, touring the world in my mind in this fantasy, for my final album, I'd call it Rigor Mortis. It'd be the perfect way to just wrap up my music career. The truth is, though, I didn't even go by Rigg in Hollywood. I went by Alan Lee. Now, Lee is a variation of my middle name, which is Leroy. Now, look, if your name is Leroy, don't get mad at me, but I hated that name. Like growing up, I just did not like that name. I didn't think I would look like a Leroy. I didn't feel like a Leroy. I don't know what a Leroy looks like or feels like, but I just didn't identify with that name. It was the craziest thing. And of course, as soon as my friends found out that my middle name is Leroy and I didn't like it, I would be Leroy Pigs forever. Like there'd be no getting away from that. So, you know what changed that for me, though? There's something very specific that changed this for me. In fact, two things. One was that my grandmother, my dad's mom, who named him, and I was named after him, she came to visit me in Austin, Texas, when I was pastoring the Calvary Chapel there. So my dad is Alan Leroy Rigg Sr. I'm Alan Leroy Rigg Jr. So my grandma came to see me, and I didn't know then, though I knew it was a possibility, but it would be the last time I would see her on this earth. I'll see her again. I know right where she is, and I'm going to go see her before long. I bet it's going to go a lot quicker than any of us can even imagine. But I'm so glad I had this special time with her, and it was an opportunity for me to ask her about things that I'd always wanted to ask her about, like what in the world she was thinking when she named my dad Alan Leroy Rigg. Like, why did she come up with that name? You know what I found out? I had no idea. Leroy was the name of her favorite uncle. Now, his name was Leroy Lemon. Now, there's a winner, Leroy Lemon. That's like a character from Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory or something. Leroy Lemon, like really? But when I found out what this man meant to her, man, did that ever soften my heart and make me feel like a dummy for, having been so funny about that name. And then after she passed, my dad showed me this picture that I'd never seen, I'd never even heard about. I didn't know anything about it. In this picture was a group of several men, 4, 5, 6 guys, I forget now. They were all like relatives of mine. In this group was Uncle Leroy, and they were all holding instruments. They had a band. Now I'm like, man, how rock star is Leroy, man? Leroy Lemon. That is like a rock star name. Isn't it funny how learning a little bit about a name can change the way we think about it, the way we feel about it? So this has everything to do with what we're talking about here, because I'm not going to break it down for you. You've probably heard this before. If not, it's now so easy to go to almost any website where you can study the Bible and click on the words to see what the original names meant. But here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that, their given names and the names they received tell a story. Let me just say first that the Babylonians were super religious. I mean, they were polytheistic. They were into astrology, but in their own way, they were super religious. So their given names, their Hebrew names, every one of those names spoke of the one true and living God. Their new names, the names that Nebuchadnezzar gave them, all spoke of different gods that were worshipped in Babylon. So again, let's think about what's happening here. This isn't like when you get a nickname that you like. This is totally different from that. When Nebuchadnezzar didn't want this to happen, their whole life, just like the food would always make them think about God, every single time Daniel or his friends heard their name, they would be reminded about their special relationship with God. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want them being reminded about that. He didn't want them thinking about that. He wanted them thinking about the gods in Babylon. And so he changed these names to move them away from God. Now, we have a spiritual enemy, don't we? We call him Satan, we call him the devil, we call him the evil one, Beelzebub, whatever. So many different things in the Bible. Actually, Lucifer, there's a whole bunch of different names, but he too has this conditioning program. We only wish it was a 3-year program. It's not. It's a lifelong program. And you know what really sucks? Satan never takes a day off. He doesn't even take a lunch break. Like, he is on it. He is on you 24/7, 365, hammering away at all of these same things, trying to move you away from the Bible, trying to move you away from a better life, trying to move you away from God. So before we go to our next point, let me just ask you, are you moving toward the Bible or away from it? As you sit here tonight, are you moving toward a better life, the life that God wants for you, or are you moving away from it? Are you moving toward God, or are you moving away from him? Daniel at the food court. Now let's make a transition. We're going to talk about Daniel in a food fight. You ready for this? Pick it up in verse 8. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." Now, God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, "I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. Now, have you guys ever been in a food fight? I don't mean like, in your dining room with your kids or, with your siblings when you're growing up. I mean like in a public place with strangers. I've totally been in one of those. It was middle school. We called it junior high back then, but we're in the cafeteria. We're sitting at a table. My friends are around this particular table, but all the tables are full. And, the din. I mean, you could barely hear your buddy talking from across the table because it's so loud. But I'll tell you what I did hear. I heard these two words. Food fight. And in an instant, visibility dropped to 0. Like you guys have heard of the food pyramid? We were building it right in the middle of the cafeteria. It was amazing. It was impressive. And I'll never forget what happened next. Now, I'm such a bad person. I shouldn't even tell you this story. I'm ashamed of myself already. You're going to have to cut me some slack because, come on now. You don't want to tell us everything you thought, said, or did when you were in junior high, right? So this is totally wrong, and I apologize in advance. But we had this assistant principal who we called Link because to us, he looked like the missing link. He had this forehead that just wouldn't stop. Like, dude would never have to buy a visor. It was like original equipment. Unbelievable. You could, if he stood outside in the snow, you could sell tickets for a ski lift. It was just insane. So we called this guy Link. And so here we are in this food fight, and Link rushes into the cafeteria to try to get things under control. And I saw it. I remember it like it happened yesterday. Some kid launches a milkshake. And I can see the styrofoam cup just spinning so tightly that frozen treat's just staying tucked in there till the right moment. And it hit Link in the head, and then I watched as that chocolate milkshake ran right off the end of his pale forehead. It was awesome. Like an academic highlight. I remember almost nothing else from that whole school year, but I remember that, man. It was unbelievable. So, okay, I want you to come on back to the Daniel story. I want you to picture this. Here's Daniel and his buddies. They're downing the delicacies, verse 8. They're washing it down with wine, verse 8. The people around them are. And then Daniel says, food fight. What? Why would Daniel want to fight about food? I want you to notice in verse 8, it says twice the word defiled. Remember, we learned before that there were lists of foods to eat and foods not to eat in the Old Testament, in the law that God gave. It's possible that they were served foods that were on the not to eat list, or as we would sometimes say, foods that weren't kosher. But it's also possible that some of these foods have been dedicated to idols. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this tonight. If you're a student of the New Testament, you know that the first Christians struggled in this same way. You know that the first Christians, many of them, found themselves in places where the only meat that was available to them was meat that had been dedicated to idols. And so they didn't know what to do. Like, was it okay? Was it not okay to buy this meat, to prepare this meat, to eat this meat, to serve this meat? And so what you might not have known, though, is that wasn't a problem that was unique to the first century. It was a problem that began long before that. It may well have been a problem for Daniel and his friends in Babylon. So we get the New Testament take. 1 Corinthians 8, verse 4, Paul says it's all about conscience. He talks about a strong conscience. A strong conscience is less sensitive. It takes way more to set it off. It's like a smoke detector that it takes a lot to set it off. Like you would have to literally start a campfire in your house under that smoke detector to set it off. And then he described a weak conscience, which is a more sensitive conscience. It'd be like a smoke detector that you're on the opposite end of the house and you think about how you need to pick up birthday candles next time you go to the store, and it goes off. So these are the two differences, the strong conscience, the weak conscience. We know that in the Bible there's black and white, but there's also gray. And so the strong conscience, the less sensitive conscience, looks at gray and sees white. Nothing wrong with it. The weak conscience, the more sensitive conscience, looks at gray and sees black. Feels like there's very much something wrong with it. Neither one is right or wrong. Paul just says that if we doubt, we're condemned if we eat, because we don't eat from faith. Whatever is not from faith is sin. So we're supposed to be sensitive to conscience, our own conscience and that of others. Now today there's a lot of talk about what this does and doesn't mean, but I'm not sure that we've really wrapped our minds around it yet. If you do something and I don't like it, you didn't stumble me. If you do something and it annoys me, you didn't stumble me. If you do something and it frustrates me, you didn't stumble me. If I do something that you don't have the freedom to do, and because I do it, you feel conflicted. Because I do it, you start to revisit it. Because I do it, you start to wonder whether or not you could do it. And then you do it. And then immediately you regret it. Immediately you feel convicted. You feel guilty. You are filled with remorse. Now I've totally stumbled you. So it's so hard, because I think that between the two camps of people who just think you should do whatever you want and people who don't think you should do anything, there's got to be some kind of a balance where on the one hand, we don't ever allow an intolerant minority to hijack the culture of an entire church, but also on the other hand, where I purpose in my own heart to make it easier for you to be true to your conscience and not harder for you to be true to your conscience. Don't we want to make it easier for others to follow Jesus and not harder? So there's got to be that balance somewhere in between. Anyway, thought I'd throw out a few takes on that. These guys might have been wrestling with something along those lines. Now, think about it. This all-you-can-eat buffet, it must have seemed like a small thing. Why not, just go ahead and cheat a little to get ahead? That's what everybody else does, right? Cut some corners. I mean, here we are in Babylon. We're so far from home. Where was God when we were abducted? And here we are in this place where, for all we know, this is life or death. We don't know what's going to happen if we don't win this little eating competition. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. They could have been like, what happens in Babylon stays in Babylon, Why not just cheat to get ahead? Why not cut a corner here, cut a corner there? But again, in verse 8, it says Daniel purposed in his heart. He had a purposeful heart. Or to put it another way, to flip it around, he had heartfelt purpose. When it comes to doing and being, it's so important that we sort out our purpose. Like, if your purpose in life, let's come over here and say that your purpose in life is primarily to do. You're all about achieving, accomplishing, accumulating. You're going to be way more tempted to cut corners to get ahead. But let's come over here and let's say that your primary focus is on being. It's on becoming the woman, becoming the man that God's called you to be, that he is, in fact, making you. Well, then you're going to be way less tempted to cheat to get ahead, to cut corners. And here's something else. This goes back to the lies we tell ourselves. Those of us who are doers first and beers second, the lie we tell ourselves is this: as soon as I do this, I'm going to get around to being. As soon as I get this promotion, as soon as I close this deal, as soon as I flip this house, as soon as I A, B, or C, then I'm going to focus on my personal growth, my spiritual growth, on serving God, on doing these other things, on looking at my character and making some changes and whatnot. And we don't ever get to it. But the people over here who put being first, who focus first on that growth and on that character, they do tend to get around to doing. So the doers don't ever get around to being. The beers almost always get around to doing. I think that all by itself tells us a lot about how we ought to approach things like this in our lives. Now, I love this. I love that Daniel and his friends, they didn't just refuse to eat. They could have been all like this, like, nope, not going to eat. Think about, your toddler at home in the high chair, and they are not going to eat. It doesn't matter what you do, you'd be like, and there's no way it's not going in their mouth. Or worse, they take it into their mouth and spit it into yours. I mean, this kind of stuff happens, right? To parents, to grandparents, this stuff happens. Daniel didn't just refuse to eat, and he didn't give up when the chief eunuch said he couldn't help him. He went on to suggest an alternative solution to the steward. You guys have heard that saying that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. There's so much truth to that. There are so few people who will offer a solution and even fewer who will take ownership of it. And trust me, this happens at church. 18 years I led Calvary Austin, the church that I founded in 1991. And if I had $1 for every time someone approached me to point out what was wrong or even to tell me what they thought should be done about it, I'd never have to work another day in my life. But it was all, if they had a solution in mind, it was always a solution for someone else. It was something for me to do. It was something for my family to do. It was something for my staff to do. Very rarely was it something that they were actually volunteering to do. And that's kind of how it is a lot of times in life, right? Do you want to excel? Do you want to excel at work? Do you want to excel at school? Do you want to make the people who live under the same roof with you really incredibly, deliriously happy? Be a problem solver and not just a problem spotter. Roll up your sleeves and be ready to implement the ideas that you have. Now, one thing that I've discovered, as we think about these guys eating vegetables, I've discovered that there are two kinds of people in the world: veggie lovers and veggie haters. I'm a veggie lover. Any other veggie lovers here tonight? Yeah, look at all those veggie lovers. Any veggie haters here tonight? Yeah, see, you can't even lift your hand all the way above your head because you're weak. You're like undernourished. You don't have the vitamins that you need. Vegetables are awesome, man. You know you love veggies when you love veggies that other veggie lovers hate. Did you follow that? Let me throw some things out, see if you're down with what I'm down with. Like who's down with the artichoke hearts? Oh, man, come on now. So good. I'm going to push it a little bit now. Brussels sprouts. Love me some Brussels sprouts. Oh, man. What are some other things that somebody on a vegetarian diet might eat that I like? What about like hominy? I can totally do the hominy. You see, I'm losing people. People who were with me just moments ago are shaking their head now like, yep, nope, he's lost me now. How about lima beans? Come on now. Little butter, little salt, never hurt. Oh, so good. But now, here's the thing. Even though I love vegetables, nobody has ever confused me with a vegetarian. No one's ever taken me for that. I love my meat. And when we were in Austin, Texas, we had a favorite place to go for barbecue. There's some good barbecue in Austin, Texas. A lot of good places. But one of my favorite places was a place called Pokey Joe's Smokehouse. And Pokey Joe's had my favorite restaurant t-shirt of all time. You know what it said? It said, "Vegetarian is Indian for can't hunt." I love that. That's how we rolled in Texas. I've got a pastor friend who said that if God didn't mean for us to eat animals, he wouldn't have made them out of steak. I think that's a philosophy to live by right there. But the point here is that, these guys chose this vegetarian diet for the reasons we talked about. It doesn't mean that we should all be vegetarians, nor does it mean that there's anything wrong with being a vegetarian. That's not the point. So Daniel at the food court, in a food fight, one more thing. You ready for this last thing? Daniel with food for thought. We're going to pick it up in verse 15. All right. At the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus, the steward took away their portion of the delicacies and the wine which they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, this was like a competitive eating situation. You ever see competitive eating on TV? It's so weird, right? You turn on like ESPN, and there's people eating hot dogs or hot wings, and they're in the middle of this contest. Like, do you ever have debates with your friends? Like, is that a sport? Like, sometimes you turn on ESPN and they're playing cards. That's a table game, right? Like, when did that become a sport? Eating now is a sport? Like, it's on the sports network? I don't know. That's just a little aside. But if you know anything about competitive eating, you know the name Joey Chestnut. Joey Chestnut is like the king of competitive eaters. This guy is unbelievable. This guy gets paid $200,000 a year to shove hot dogs down his throat. If I had known when I was a teenager that I could get paid to eat like that, it would have changed my life, man. Forget about any kind of career path. Just post up at the all-you-can-eat buffet and develop your skills, man. $200,000 a year. Unbelievable. But these guys, they went for this vegetarian diet, and they won their eating competition. Unbelievable, right? It's crazy. It's insane. Before you run down to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or Sprouts or wherever you like to get your produce, notice the fine print on this diet, verse 15. It says they were fatter in flesh. Now, I don't have a degree in marketing. I'm not a marketing genius, but I just think that's a terrible way to market a diet. Fatter in flesh, like, it's because I'm fatter in flesh that I'm counting points and steps like all the time. I don't think there's any danger at all that Atkins, South Beach, Weight Watchers are going to borrow this tagline, fatter in flesh. But obviously this has less to do with one's gut and more to do with one's God. So hear me out now. From a purely pragmatic standpoint, life with God works in a way that life without him doesn't. Let me say it again. Life with God works in a way that life without him doesn't. So what part of your life isn't working? And in what way is that part of your life out of alignment with God? You know, when I was pastoring in Austin, there was a couple years in there where my sister and her family lived in Austin. And so my sister drove a van, and she was telling me one day about what her van was doing. And I said, well, you know, it sounds to me like it's out of alignment. She said, well, would you go with me to the shop and explain to them? And I'm like, sure, I'll go with you. So we went down there and described it to them, and they're like, oh, yeah, that definitely sounds like, you know, you need an alignment. Let me pull you up on the computer. So they pulled her up on the computer because she'd been there before, and they were like, oh, yeah, you were here 6 months ago. We told you 6 months ago you needed an alignment. Now, here's what's never happened in the history of driving, ever. No one with a car out of alignment has ever been driving down the street and hit a pothole. Boom! Hey, we're back in alignment. Like, no one's ever just driven their car back into alignment. And no one's ever just lived their life back into alignment. If our lives are out of alignment with God, we're going to have to be intentional. We're going to have to be purposeful as we approach it, right? I mean, like, for real, if there's a part of your life that's out of alignment, read the Bible and see what it says about that part of your life. Pray and ask God to show you about that part of your life. Reach out to wise people around you who, you know, have maybe been just a little bit further down the road, who can speak into that part of your life. Then verse 18, at the end of the days when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Man, it's test time. Didn't you hate test time when you were in school? I hated it. There were pop quizzes, midterms, finals. There were written tests. There were oral tests. There were fill-in-the-blank tests, and multiple choice tests, and true-false tests. I mean, how many of you get anxious and break out into a sweat when you hear the words, now take out your Scantron form and your number 2 pencil? Like, the very idea of having to fill in those bubbles is so stressful. No! It's 3 years later. And these guys, they had to go through an oral exam before Nebuchadnezzar himself. How scary must that have been? But they aced it. They aced it. And notice in verse 21, it says that Daniel continued. You know, if we continued to read Daniel, we would discover something very interesting. And that is that for Daniel and his friends, their story didn't end in the food court. Daniel's friends' story didn't end in the food court. In chapter 3, for them, there would be a fiery furnace. Daniel's story didn't end in a food court. For him, in chapter 6, there would be a lion's den. In many ways, the tests only get harder. And the Christian life is one that requires courage. Some people talk about how religion or faith or Christianity in particular is a crutch. And we often say it's not a crutch. It's the whole hospital, man. It's the triage, the ER, the ICU, the NICU. It's all of the above. But make no mistake about it, following Jesus is not for the faint of heart. It will require a level and a degree of courage and stick-to-itiveness and perseverance that you've never known before. But for these guys, do you think that if Daniel's friends had not experienced this test in the food court, that they ever could have been prepared for this test in the fiery furnace? Do you think that if Daniel had not experienced this test in the food court, that he ever could have been prepared for that test in the lion's den? I would say no. And the same thing holds true for us. I mean, just stop and think for a moment about your own life. If you feel like you're in a food court right now, and there's a part of you that feels like, well, God, where were you when they abducted me, when they took me to Babylon, when they put me through this whole ordeal? If you knew that on the other side of your food court was a lion's den or a fiery furnace, could you thank God for the food court? Could you see your experience in the food court as a mercy? Would change everything, wouldn't it? I mean, doesn't it change everything about how we see this stuff? You think about this because on the one hand, God was testing them, but on the other hand, Satan was tempting them. And I'm sure that they might have said to themselves the same things we say to ourselves. Don't we look at what we see as the small things? We look at, it's just a food court, man. It's just a combo meal. Like it's just a little sin. It's not a big sin. Just a little tiny harmless. It's not like this big, just a little. Isn't that the lie we tell ourselves? So check this out. You probably think I'm going to say this because I've heard this 100 times. That if you compromise in the small things, you are going to compromise in the big things. That's not necessarily true. Some people compromise in small things and don't ever go on to compromise in big things. But while it's not necessarily true that everyone who compromises in a small thing will go on to compromise in a big thing, everyone who compromises in a big thing compromised in a small thing first. I know by experience. All of my biggest mistakes have been preceded by smaller ones. You know it by experience. All of your biggest mistakes have been preceded by smaller ones. So you know what this means, right? This means that the little stuff matters. Or maybe we should say it this way. Maybe we should say this. Maybe we should say, there is no little stuff. It's all big stuff. Well, again, look at these guys and understand that it's right here and it's right now in your food court, in my food court, that attitudes are being developed, that habits are being formed. The decisions that we're making now, rather than having nothing to do with the decisions that we'll make later, they have everything to do with the decisions that we'll make later. And yet it says in verse 21, as we saw already, Daniel continued. Dan the man. Dan, he would outlast Nebuchadnezzar, Dan would. He would outlast the Babylonian Empire, Dan would. He would be there when the Medo-Persians conquered the Babylonians. After that, the Grecians would conquer the Medo-Persians. The Romans would conquer the Grecians, bringing us right up to New Testament times when these wise men come from the east. How in the world did those wise men know? How did they know that a king would be born to the Jews? How do they know to look for the star and to follow the star? Scholars think that it's almost certainly because of the life, the message, the ministry of this man Daniel. It's because of his relocation. It was because of his faithfulness to God. It was because of the way he allowed God to transform him under those circumstances and use him there, that these guys would, centuries later, 600 years later, see that star and know what it meant and follow it. These wise men would come and they would worship. So think about it. When we, like Daniel, experience transformation and relocation, worship happens, wisdom comes. All of that is wrapped up in this. And so we've seen Daniel at the food court, in a food fight, and with food for thought. So are you in a food court tonight? Are you in a place not unlike Daniel and his friends, being tested, being tempted? As you're sitting there in the food court, I want you to recognize something. I want you to recognize God's presence in their food court. If you were to go back and read this chapter later, you'd see God's fingerprints all over it from the beginning of it. In verse 2, it says the Lord gave. In verse 9, it says God brought. In verse 17, it says God gave. So as you're there in your food court, I want you to take a look around. Do you see God's fingerprints on the back of your chair? Do you see his fingerprints on the napkin dispenser and on the flatware? Do you see his fingerprints on the light switch and on the door handle? God's fingerprints are all over your situation. He hasn't forgotten you, not for 1 minute. Not one aspect of what you're going through has escaped his attention. He loves you. He cares about you. He understands you. He's here for you. He wants to touch you. He wants to fill you. He wants to empower you. He wants to help you. Can you open your heart? Can you receive that tonight?